Welcome to this Photoshop training tutorial. In this particular session we're going to look at the use of the histogram and levels to tonally adjust an image. This particular image is very dull, very flat, a bit washed out as you might call it. If it was printed it would look particularly dull and flat when printed. Now, using both the histogram and levels, we're going to tonally adjust this image to make it look the best as possible. And you'll really notice how the colours start to come out a lot more once you've adjusted the image, and this is technically what we call setting the black and white points of an image. First of all, a little trip round the image is that we look over here in probably the darkest part of the image. I've got my info palette here, and I've got one side set to CMYK. And where I move my cursor around is it then gives me a CMYK breakdown of the inks that are making up that particular part of the image. So I can see even in the darkest areas I've got quite a small amount of the K, the black value, only 45% there. Maybe slightly darker down here. No, it's still only 45%, so no good dark areas there. If I look in the highlight parts of the image, I put my cursor over the white of the snow here. As you can see, there's no ink there at all, so that is a pure white part of the image. Usually something that printers will not want to print, the white of the paper will show through. And just over here, again we have some pure white, and here we just have a little bit of ink detail showing through, small amounts of ink in these areas. So I obviously don't want to increase the amount of highlight in this image because that would bleach even more detail, but I do want to give it a good level of contrast. Looking at the histogram, how a histogram works is the left side of the histogram denotes the black point of the image, and then we move through the dark shadows through to the lighter shadows onto the midtones, through the highlights, and on eventually into the whites of the image. Now, the higher the spiky bits, you can see here that particular bit is right to the top of the histogram. The higher the spiky bits, it means the more pixels there are that fall into that part of the category of the image tonally. So if I was to click and drag over this histogram like that, is that really what I've done there is that I've highlighted the vast majority of pixels that are in this image, and you can see most of them exist between upper shadows, lower midtones through to the upper midtones. And I guess here that little highlight just there is obviously the pure white parts of the image. To get a full reproduction shade, whether you're reproducing on screen or in print as an example, is ideally on a picture like this is you want to have a wide histogram. The wider the histogram, the more shades that are being reproduced, and consequently the better the contrast or the tone of the image. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to bring back my little palette here. Now, I'm going to use levels to make some tonal corrections to this, and I'm going to do this in conjunction with watching my histogram and also my info palette. I've got my eyedropper tool here, and if I click and keep my finger down, I can select what's called the color sampler tool. I'm just going to move that back out of the way. I'm going to put one sample. I'm just going to click and it's going to add sample number 1 there, and you can see how it's added it onto the info palette. And then I'm going to put another sample here. So effectively what I've got is that I've got one sample keeping an eye on the shadow parts of the image and another sample keeping an eye for me on the highlight parts of the image. And these are the ones that I'm going to monitor to be able to see what I'm doing with ink values. Down here on my info palette it's defaulted to RGB because the image is in RGB, but I want to see this in CMYK, so I'm just where the little eyedropper symbol is here, I click onto there and then I can choose to change this to be a CMYK readout, which is my preference, especially as I'm going to print this image. So you can see sample number 2 has no inks at all, whereas sample number 1 is showing me statically what those values are. Keeping an eye on my histogram, you can see there's not a lot of information from there to there in the histogram, which tells me at a glance there's not a lot of deep shadow or depth to the image. I'm going to go to the image menu and go to adjustments, and then I'm going to choose levels. And one of the things that's good about levels is it has the histogram repeated in it. In here, what I'm going to do the first thing is to move my little black slider to the right to increase the shadow point of the image. A little known trick in Photoshop is that if you hold down the Alt key, same on both Mac and Windows, and now if I drag this slider, you'll see that the screen goes completely white. Slowly, as I get to where the pixels start, keep your eye on the bottom left-hand corner, is that as pixels appear, that's a way of Photoshop telling you that the black point, or pure black, has been achieved in the image. So if I then let go, I then get that. Now, coming to look at my sample point number 1 on my info palette, is it's now showing me before and after values. So you can see that as well as the cyan, magenta and yellow have increased, the amount of black has gone up from 45 to 80%, and you can see the dramatic change in the detail in the image, and much better strong lower midtones and shadows now. Notice my histogram over here is now a lot wider. It's got the previous histogram in a sort of ghosted image in behind this, but you can see it's now going almost the full width, so I know I'm getting a much better tonal range to the image. And now I'm going to consider the white point, the highlight point of the image. So I've got my second little eyedropper there, and you can see that there are still no ink in those areas whatsoever. So I'm going to do this trick of holding down the Alt key again, and as I drag the highlight, and automatically at the start it indicates to me there's lots of white in the image. I'm just going to put that back and let go of the Alt key. If I was to increase the amount of highlight in the image, what's happening to the white areas is I'm bleaching out all of their detail. So more and more of the highlight areas in the image are becoming devoid of detail and just moving to pure white. So I'm going to put that back, so I'm actually happy with the highlight point of the image. The last thing I want to do then is I want to adjust some of the midtones in the image. So looking round the midtones is I'm now looking at this sample over here, and I can see that I've increased the amount of black as well as other colours throughout the midtones quite a lot. So I'm going to choose now to move my midtones to the left slightly, which will lighten the midtones in the image. So it's keeping my black point relatively unaffected and also my highlight point unaffected, but bringing out a lot more detail on the midtones. So I can then click OK, and there's my finished image. So if I look at my histogram now, I've got a much wider histogram, so I know that I'm getting a better reproduction of shades. Of course, not everyone can believe what they see on their monitor, and it all depends on the amount of brightness and contrast. I'm using a flat panel monitor, an Apple monitor, which tends to make all images, even quite washed out images, look quite rich and yummy and vivid on the screen. So the great thing about the histogram is it allows you to forecast your output capability. To finish this, as I normally do, I'm going to go to the history. If I click the little camera icon down here, this allows me to take another snapshot of the image. And if I double click that, I could then call it after levels as an example. So if I now click back onto the original, you can see the histogram has updated itself, a much narrower histogram, showing us here there's no really good dark shadow areas, and look at the image, very washed out, very flat. And if I now click onto my changed version, considerably better. So I've got a wider histogram at the same time. Last thing I might want to do is just to remove these two little sample points, and you do that by just holding down the Alt key and you get a little pair of scissors, so I can then just click to remove those two samples, and there we go. So that's using some colour sample points, levels and the histogram to be able to understand setting the tonal range of your image.